Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in. Okay, so last week we ended off talking about Russia and Ukraine. Let's segue into Europe. Maybe we could start with England.
Yeah, so England is in kind of a bad way. They have productivity problems. Their productivity has been stagnant. Their wages have been stagnant. They can't get anything built. So if you think that the United States has trouble building like housing, for example, the UK has more trouble than we do. They have a lot more trouble. They are really the true build nothing country. They just have this thicket of restrictions on building anything that's been built up over a long time. And this is really hurting them. Brexit has obviously hurt them quite a bit. They are actually so ironically, Brexit made immigration shift from Europe to places like Pakistan. So now Britain is getting a lot of immigration from places like that instead of places like Europe. So for the like keep Britain white people, they sort of lost out big from that. That really backfired a lot on them. I guess anyway. But Brexit has decreased economic ties between the UK and Europe, and that is just hurting British businesses. Britain got really hurt in the financial crash of the early 2010s, like a decade ago, because their economy is really based on finance. They've got they had this finance centric industrial policy under Margaret Thatcher, and they had the City of London, blah blah blah, and that sort of covered up a lot of underlying deficiencies in other industries because they acted as sort of the finance arm of Europe, right? They were the New York of Europe. London was the New York of Europe, and that allowed Britain as a place to be dysfunctional in many ways and essentially paper it over because they earned all these rents from the financial industry. And then when the financial crash happened, that really put a damper on that. And then when they separated from Europe with Brexit, that really compounded the problem because now Europe doesn't want you to be there in New York. Europe is going to move its finance stuff somewhere else. And so that really hurts them. And, they don't have stuff they can fall back on like manufacturing export industries or whatever, because guess what? You can't build a factory in the UK. You can't build anything in the UK. You can't, build a post office box in the UK. And so that's really hurting them. And so that's where the UK is. They're basically in this doom loop of stagnation. Their political class doesn't seem prepared to deal with it. You had, idiots like Liz Truss, who's just the biggest. How do they make the dumbest person in the UK prime minister? She, lasted less than head of lettuce and governed worse because she just thought, okay, well, we'll just do a whole bunch of Reagan-esque tax cuts and, that'll juice the economy. Well, instead, guess what? That doesn't work if you're like a small open economy who depends on, the value of your small independent currency. The pound just crashed and everybody like lost confidence in the pound, and they had to quickly reverse it. And Liz Truss was out faster than head of lettuce. So the UK really is just not, being serious at all. And the problem is really its internal political economy. They've got this out of touch political class and a bunch of domestic sort of culture wars. They argue about trans stuff constantly. And it's just, they can't really seem to be able to focus on bread and butter issues. At the same time, nobody has a place to live. And so the country is just falling into this sort of disused shabbiness. And, you can see British economics writers kind of flailing and wondering if can free trade save us? Well, no, you have to actually just free trade can't, you have to run an effective economy. You have to build the basic building blocks of an effective economy. And so all the writers at The Economist and, the Financial Times are flailing a little bit. They don't know what to do. But I think a first step is to just get the British people interested in the idea of economic growth and the fact that this is important and should happen. One problem is that Britain is also the center of the degrowth ideology. Degrowth really is first and foremost a British ideology. It's somewhat Swedish too, but Britain is very central to this ideology. You have people like Jason Hickel. You have a lot of intellectuals who basically say growth is bad, and it's kind of a way of rationalizing this decline. You've actually seen this is a long tradition in British society. You've seen since the imperial days, right? The empire went away, and then the Nazis beat them up a lot, and they had this post-imperial decline. And they sort of there was a lot of leftist energy in cultural spaces, like, I don't know, Michael Moorcock books, were devoted toward glorifying the decline of Britain in the post-imperial time. I think degrowth sort of continued that. It's this idea that the decline is good, because because if our growth hurts the poor people, then we're actually saving the world by not growing. And it's completely idiotic, but it meshes well with Britain's anti-growth policies, and it's a way of just sort of saying, well, we're being virtuous. It's sort of like you know it's pseudo-austerianism is what it really is. It's this this idea that growth was your sin, and now you're being punished for your sins, and somehow growth is the same as imperialism. And it's this toxic ideology that finds a receptive audience in Britain simply because of the fact that it's easier to just tell yourself that poverty is good than to get rich sometimes. And so Britain is screwed.
So what's your advice for them? What should they be doing?
Growth. So my advice is, first of all, decide that growth is good. Then systematically figure out what the barriers to growth are and eliminate them. One of them is obviously, passing some new laws to essentially allow a lot more construction of anything. Right. Increasing research spending. Britain's research spending is terrible. They have their scientific apparatus is withered. Understand that Britain is a small export oriented economy, a small economy in a great big world. It is not big anymore. The British Empire is just a century over, right? It's gone. We don't even remember it anymore. And you got to export. Britain's got to export and figure out how to do that.
Got it. Let's segue to France.
All right. So France is doing all right because in the 1970s, France was farsighted and built a ton of nuclear reactors when a lot of other people were scared to do that in the 80s. France built nuclear and now runs mostly on nuclear. Nobody else did. And so now France is kind of the energy powerhouse of Europe because they were willing to do this. For all the nuke bros in our audience, the reason they were able to do this is because of big government. So France was very statist. And nuclear is very statist because private actors are almost never willing to shoulder the big risk of paying up front for a nuclear plant that takes 30 years to pay off. So the government basically has to finance nuclear plants all the time, anywhere. That's true anywhere. And small modular reactors were supposed to solve that problem. They did not. So nuclear is a statist enterprise, and France is a statist country. And this is why France was able to build a lot of nuclear, and they did. So that was good for France. France has many other issues. France is basically doing okay. And for the energy reason, because, Germany is a place that's increasingly hard to build stuff because they had this great idea that if they got dependent on Russian gas, we'll talk about that in a second, but if they got dependent on Russian gas, then Russia would become a nice country, which was just never going to happen. And so now you can't build stuff in Germany very easily, also because Germany has this Green Party that is mentally stuck in like 2004 and, is pressuring the ruling coalition they made them shutter all the nuclear plants right in the middle of an energy crisis. And so Germany's being, run by idiots. And so France is benefiting from this because it's sort of like an alternative. One problem with France is that it's a chaotic society. France has always been a bit chaotic. They had the French Revolution, but what people don't realize is that they had continuous revolution-style disruptions for a century afterwards, or well over a century afterwards, actually, ending only maybe in the 1960s after the big riots then. But France has always been a little bit like that, and there's been giant riots in France for as long as I can remember. The tenor of the riot sort of changes, but you don't always know what they're about. So like the Gilets jaunes, the yellow jacket guys, what were they even rioting about? It was never, they just didn't like Macron. And, I'm just going to massacre French pronunciations because they deserve it. So France is, it's pretty chaotic in many ways. And it's got weird ideas. France is the oldest and weirdest modern Western country, right? They were the first sort of like country to emerge from the Middle Ages. in a big way. And they developed weirdly, and they're just weird. And so France is taking its own, its political economy is very odd. But now, so what we see now is Macron is very anti-Putin, and even the right winger Marine Le Pen is becoming very anti-Putin. So France is standing up and like, okay, so now we're in charge. Everybody follow us. We're gonna fuck Putin up, and this is great. This is also what they did in the Crimean War, I guess. At that time, France's population was at that time the largest in Europe, and during the Crimean War, the sort of French ability to mobilize manpower was essential to being able to gather a coalition of people to stop Russia. So in the Crimean War, Britain, France, and some other countries united to basically push Russia out of part of Ukraine. And so essentially, and it looks like France is trying to turn this into Crimean War too. We can think about the similarities later, but France is taking this diplomatic lead in Europe that is that could create political unity for pro-growth policies. France is a very generous welfare state. Sometimes some of the parts of that are very well administered and work very well, and some of the parts of that do not work very well. There's rules against working, which are basically bad, and France needs to reform those. But then, so the political will to do that might come from responding to external threats of Russia, and so that's kind of the hope.
Let's get into Germany.
Right. So Germany is run by complete fools and is just completely messing around. Germany Germany's been messing around for a while now. So, on one sense, in one sense, I understand this because Germany had the Nazis and, they were divided for a long time, and basically Britain and Russia together promulgated the idea that Germany is bad. Germany, you're bad people. And so Germany's like, no, we're good. And so spent many, many years trying to prove that they were good guys, in a way that really catered to the desires of outside powers, America, Britain, and Russia. Right. So Germany was sort of doing penance for its evilness during World War II. And the British would tell you their evilness during World War I, but that's a little more contested. But yeah, so Germany's been doing penance for having the Nazis for a long time mentally. And there's sort of this lack of national idea of what makes a country good. Whereas America, at least up until recently, had this idea that America, we are good, American flag, look, we're good by definition. Our acronym is US. That spells us. And Germany was like, oh no, are we Nazis? What are we standing for? We stand for world peace and European unity and anti-nationalism and blah, blah. So the problem is that's fine for a while, right? And it was fine for the Cold War, when you could basically get America to say, hey, Germany, build up an army and be the first line of defense against Russia. They were like, okay, friends, we'll do that. And they built up this actually pretty good military. And they were very industrious, industrialization of Germany in the post-war period was really good. They were really powerful machine tools, autos, basically anything that involved mechanical engineering. Germany is the best at in the world. Better than Japan, better than Korea, better than anywhere. And so Germany is sort of that attitude of just be the hapless, ingenuous, trusting good guys is coming back to bite them. And Germany has become too high trust a society. We always talk about trust and how it's great. Well, guess who Germany trusted? American banks in the housing bubble, right? Deutsche Bank was this just giant dumping ground that unscrupulous American banks could unload their shitty housing-backed bonds right before they exploded, right? So it was oh, the Germans are the buyer of last resort for this stuff. The Germans it's rated AAA, dear. And you could sell all your stuff to the Germans for ridiculous prices. And this is all, this is in The Big Short. And there's a lot of places documenting this. And then, in Greece, Greek government bonds, dear, we'll buy that. Very trusting, right? And so, but that wasn't even the worst. So then they trusted the Chinese, and that Siemens, this German company with incredibly high technology that spent all this money, all this time and effort of decades and decades building up all this high technology, they, and inventing it really for trains. They built all these trains in China, And China is like, okay, well, you have to do it in a joint venture, work very closely with our Chinese engineers, do everything, and then blah, blah. And then, and Germany's like, okay, because if we do this, contract with China, then with the joint venture, then we'll get a whole bunch of other contracts. And look, there's this massive Chinese market and we can get all this revenue, blah, blah, blah. Well, what did the Chinese do? They simply had their engineers learn all the tricks from the German engineers, learn how to do all the things from the German engineers. And then they kicked Siemens out, made their own train companies with the tech that they often stole and sometimes just learned, but often just actually thefted from German computers. And they took this technology that they learned and they built a bunch of really good trains. And now they're competing with Siemens, and they're outcompeting Siemens with government subsidies with the technology they stole from Siemens. So Siemens is screwed on trains because China screwed them and because they were incredibly trusting. And so this pattern repeats again and again. So KUKA Robotics is another example of this. Germany selling off this really top robotics firm for like pennies on the dollar to like China just for a quick buck. One reason is because the German corporate class is incredibly cynical. The German corporate class basically thinks that the government has no interest in promoting it. And basically, so they're just like, okay, we're just going to go make money however we can. Even burning the furniture and selling it to China, we'll make a little bit of money. And after that, we'll be dead. But who cares, because Germany isn't going to support us anyway. So there's a lot. So within Germany, the business class is very cynical. And there's not really, there's not much nationalism to bind them to like the idea of Germany, because there's the idea that nationalism is bad. That's Nazi, right? So that's a problem. Meanwhile, you have idiot Greens who basically take the dumbest ideas out of like the British degrowth movement and canonize them, and so that's so a lot of the German left has turned toward Greta Thunbergism. So they forced Germany to shutter its nuclear plants in the middle of a crisis. That was very stupid. Meanwhile, Germany thought the absolute worst mistake was Germany thinking they could trust Putin to provide them with their entire energy supply and become dependent on Putin. They thought this would bind Russia to Europe and make Russia a nice civilized country that was part of Europe instead of being like outside of Europe, the menace on the external borders. Well, guess what? No, it just thralled you to the empire of Russia. The shitty petrostate empire is now your master. And this didn't have to happen. Germany could have built a bunch of nuclear plants and then later, built a bunch of solar and wind. Because Germany has NIMBY problems too, and imported a bunch of liquefied natural gas and blah, 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 blah. It could have done all these things. It didn't. Instead, it's like, we'll just buy all our gas from Russia. And so they did. And guess what happened? The very predictable thing happened is that Putin betrayed them and invaded Europe and all this stuff. So Germany has just gotten repeatedly screwed by being this high trust place, and has, political problems because basically domestically, the only people who are willing to really stand up strongly for Germany's interests as a country are kind of Nazis, honestly. The AfD party, they're like not, Hitler. They're not quite Hitler, but like they're bad. They're bad guys. And the problem is that the Christian Democrats and the SPD, none of the they haven't figured out liberal nationalism. They haven't figured out how to be FDR. They've never had an FDR. Ironically, arguably the closest thing they ever had to FDR was like Bismarck. And so, and that was a long time ago, and he was that was a different era. There was never any notion that like we should, there was like a brief period of liberal nationalism in like the late 1800s, and that was it. And so Germany doesn't really have experience with liberal nationalism. And so, it's still either just like Nazi or dumbass. It's like, or Weimar too. And don't do that. Like, it's not Weimar too, because you don't have like leftists and rightists battling it out in the streets of Germany. You don't have this chaos, right? You just have this sort of sleepy complacency that like, if we just trust everybody, then it'll all turn out okay. And it won't. And Germany needs to show a little, show a little backbone, show a little leadership, show a little intelligence, honestly. Like, stop trusting people, start, really making sure the German industrial base is secure, build a bunch of domestic energy stuff very quickly. Restart all your nuclear plants, first of all, and then build a bunch of like solar, wind, nuclear, whatever you got. Import a bunch of liquefied natural gas. They're actually doing that. Germany has another problem that compounds all this stuff, which is a love of austerity. There's this, German policy is basically entirely defined by the traumas of the early 20th century. And so one of those traumas was inflation. You have the guy with the wheelbarrow of money. We've all seen that photo. And so it's this idea that we have to have high interest rates and like low deficits forever so that we have hard money. By the way, this is also a mistake that Taiwan makes. Taiwan is actually extremely German in their economic approach, and people don't know that, but that's a story for another day. Germany refuses to spend a bunch of government money, refuses to do like temporary big outlays of government money on things they need to do, such as building a bunch of energies. Right now they need to be spending big with the government on building a bunch of energy, but they're not, because they have this historical, cultural, knee-jerk commitment to austerity that also hurt them in the financial crisis, that also hurt them in the Great Recession, and it's coming back to bite them. So Germany's the defense mechanisms Germany built up related to the traumas of the early 20th century are now weighing them down. And that's the basic story of Germany.
You're like a geopolitical therapist, diagnosing.
Yes. And I need to write this. Like, my message to Germany is, okay, look, if you look at someone on my mom's side of the family has a book of a family tree, and it looks like a stump. Half the tree looks like it has been burned away because at some point some angry Germans came through, insane Germans came through and just killed half my family, right? A lot of people would be mad about this. I'm not mad. And I don't think that, I think people shouldn't, Germany now is not the Germany that did that. And none of the people in Germany now running Germany or living in Germany are any of the people who did that. Like, historical guilt is not a real thing. Like, people, it's good to learn lessons, right? It's good to have institutional memory of these things. We shouldn't forget them. But at the same time, there comes a time when you have to say, okay, that was somebody else. Like my great grandfather, was like a serial killer. Okay. I'm not him, right? I'm not the serial killer great grandfather. All right. At some point you've got.
And to be clear, you're not saying your great grandfather was a serial killer. You're saying Germany's.
I don't know. Yes. Germany's Germany's great grandfather was a serial killer. Hitler, Nazis. Yep. Bad. Yeah, the worst ever. Honestly, like the worst ever. Really, like, people do not understand how bad the Nazis were. Because people think, oh, they killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. That was just like an appetizer. Like, Hitler, the plan was the explicit plan was to kill, over 100 million Slavs, and enslave the remainder in a slavery system modeled after America's old slavery system, racial slavery system, and colonize all of Eurasia. And that was just the plan they had in place then. Like, what do you think they would have done with like China and, the Middle East and whoever else they could get their hands on? Like, they would just be like, oh, also inferior race, die. And the only thing that would have stopped them would be like Imperial Japan having nukes. Like, that's what would have happened had they won World War II. They, as it is, they killed 27 million Soviet citizens. Like, they were like, and a lot of those were just either intentionally starved in cities like Leningrad or like killed in POW camps by the million. Like, these are the worst guys who ever lived. Like, there's nobody worse than that. And yet, so the Nazis are actually, their badness is underrated. We actually don't even realize how bad the Nazis were because we focus only on the Holocaust instead of like the whole picture of all the other things they also did. So they were the worst ever, but modern Germany is just not them at all. Institutionally, it's not. People wise, it's not. It's like, that's not you. It still has the name Germany. It's still on vaguely the same plot of land, but it's not, you're not Nazis anymore, and you don't have to act like penitent, ex-Nazis, because you're not. You're just a country that is a liberal democracy and should stand up for liberal democracy in concert with your liberal democratic allies. And, and that's what you should do.
Okay. That's good advice. We'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts
to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.
Let's segue into Italy.
I don't really know much about Italy. Italy's really terrible. They're just stagnating and declining. Like I don't know why, because I haven't really looked at it much. So Italy, you're screwed, but I haven't bothered to figure out why yet. And maybe that's the worst part of worst way in which you're screwed is that people don't even care. Benito Mussolini once said, it's not impossible to rule the Italians. It's just useless. And he said a lot of dumb stuff, but the point is that something's going very wrong in Italy, and I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
So Italy, get your act together, but I haven't figured out how yet. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned. What other countries in Europe should we discuss? Greece, Hungary, Spain.
We already discussed Russia in the last episode, right?
We did Russia in the last episode. Yeah.
Yeah. So Poland is the one we should discuss.
Okay.
So Poland is great. Poland is doing awesome, despite some demographic issues. Their aging population, and they had a lot of people emigrate. The Polish, the handsome Polish plumber in the UK, right? He's going to take your girlfriend. So then, actually, I'm going to a wedding in Poland fairly soon, which is. The bride is British, but her family's Polish, so they're doing a wedding in Poland for the extended family. Oh, cool. And Britain got a lot of benefit from Polish immigrants. But anyway, so Poland itself has done great, and they did great with a very similar strategy to the one employed by Malaysia, to some degree by China, which is FDI, foreign direct investment. So Poland basically said, okay, we're going to manufacture stuff for mostly Germany, but also for, France, Britain, Netherlands, whoever else wants to manufacture stuff here, invest in Poland. And they set up special economic zones. They had lots of incentives. They made it very easy to build things, factories. They had a very educated population who could, work, not just slap stuff together, but also could actually run machines and understand things and re-engineer stuff on the fly and fix little defects and, improve stuff constantly. So they had all that stuff. And Germany's like, okay, well, people aren't letting us build stuff in Germany because of the idiot Greens and because of just general government fecklessness and because also we just, want cheap labor costs. And so they were like, okay, they plowed into Poland, right? So Poland became the manufacturing base of Germany. And to a lesser extent, places like Hungary and Romania, Turkey also became the manufacturing base of German companies. But then Poland, especially benefited. Their policies were especially good. And so you see that Poland was actually poorer during the Eastern Bloc days, during the communist days. Poland was poorer than Russia and poorer than many of the Soviet republics. And it was intentionally kept poor by the Soviets, by the Russians, because the Russians see Poland as this rival for influence within the Slavic world, and they have to always keep Poland down and keep Poland poor. So Poland was kept intentionally poor and was one of the first countries to break away from communism. You had the Solidarity movement, which was a labor movement. They were leftist, but they weren't communist. And so, they broke away, and Poland sort of emerged and started integrating itself into Europe. And Europe required Poland, as a condition for joining the EU, Europe required Poland to improve their institutions a lot to be in keeping with EU regulations, and that helped them a lot too, because communism left countries with a lot of very dysfunctional sort of institutions, right? And so Poland sort of improved on that via the EU. And so they've got export-oriented manufacturing through FDI. They've got, improved institutions through the EU. They've got, good education policies and blah, blah, blah. And so Poland really grew. And so now Poland is much richer. It's richer than Russia, even with all Russia's oil and gas and all that stuff. Much richer than most of the Soviet, post-Soviet economies, and basically one of the richest of the ex-Eastern Bloc countries. And it's basically, I would say Poland is at this point a developed country. Poland is no longer even really a developing country. It's basically a rich country. It's a little, it's about as rich as Portugal. It passed up Portugal.
Wow.
So like if we think of Portugal as a rich country, then we have to think of Poland as a rich country, and it's going to pass up Spain, Italy, and Greece. I think it already passed up Greece, but I think it's going to pass up Italy and Spain. So, Poland is headed for, France, England, Germany levels of income, right? Which is not quite as rich as the US, but it's rich. And they're becoming a defense manufacturing powerhouse because Poland recognizes the Russian threat and does not mess around. Poland is raising defense spending they say they're going to raise defense spending to 4%. They've already raised it, I think, to 3.5. And, in comparison, everyone else in NATO like all the other European countries in NATO struggle to raise it to like 2. And Russia's at 8 right now for the war or more. That's just the official amount is 8. It's probably a lot more. So Poland is going to spend on defense. Remember those HIMARS little missile trucks we sent Ukraine that were like pretty effective in plinking Russian stuff? We sent Ukraine like a few dozen of those, I think. Poland just ordered a few hundred. Like, they just ordered a lot of those HIMARS. They are not messing around. And so Poland is doing what countries in the 20th century did. Promoting manufacturing, getting their act together institutionally, responding to external threats, and building up their military. And they're, because of Russia, because they have this country that's 4 times the size of them. About 4 times the size of them on their, that hates them. And that, who regards them as like the main enemy number one. Like Russia's enemy number one is not Germany. It's not, it's not even Ukraine. It's Poland. And when Tucker Carlson went to interview Putin, he just constantly talked about Poland and history of Poland fighting Russia and how sucky Poland is and blah, blah, blah. So Russia does not like Poland. They're coming for them. And so this war, by the way, does not end with Ukraine. It, arguably it ends with Poland, right? Poland is like the ultimate prize because that was part of the old Russian Empire under the Tsars. And Putin basically wants to restore all territory that the Tsars owned. And so basically that includes taking over Poland.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. Before leaving Europe, I want to ask some higher level questions about Europe. So on immigration and on the EU. So first on immigration, are the problems, quote unquote, of immigration in Europe overstated? That there is a increasing sort of population that's largely Muslim, I believe, and coming in and sort of not assimilating, and that's there was probably in France and in the UK. Is that just reactionaries, or is there an actual real immigration problem? What should they do?
So there is a problem, but Europe has such high standards for what they think of as for not having crime, that to them that is unacceptably high crime, right? And the same is true if Americans go to Europe. Like if a large number of Americans went to Europe, we'd be committing tons of crime, and it would be the American problem. Blah blah blah. Russia, which is as high crime as America, by the way. Actually a bit higher. Russia's still higher crime than America. They would have a problem. So Europe just happens to be this extremely safe place, unusually extremely safe. The only place that's really comparable is like East Asia in terms of safety, and that's recent. So that's not a eternal characteristic of these like peaceful Europeans. That's very recent. Like if you go back to the 90s, like Swedish murder rates were pretty high. Right. So and then before that, much higher. Like Europe used to be a somewhat violent place. Right. And pockets of Europe are still somewhat violent. They have strict gun control, but in Britain, you just have massive amounts of stabbings. And but the safety that Europe has created is a creature of the last 25 years, really 25, 30 years. The safety of Europe. And now immigrants are coming in and not really committing many crimes, but to Europe they are. And so, that's a problem. And the other thing is that there's 2 other problems. One is that Europe has often defined itself ethnically. And I don't mean racially. I don't mean that Europeans think I am white, you are not white. That is really not a very European way of thinking. The white versus non-white distinction was invented mostly outside, like Britain and its offshoots, who were sailing around and meeting and sometimes conquering, enslaving, sometimes being conquered and enslaved by people who looked very different from them. And so they white was like this differentiator, right? Because they sort of knew how to deal with like the Spanish or French, and they didn't quite know how to deal with like these other people. And so they're like, okay, you're not white, right? Whereas the Jesuits who went to China in like the 1500s, they were like, hey, we should be able to trade with these guys because they're white like us Italians, said the Jesuits. So anyway, that's like when they say race is a social construct, that's what they mean. Or well, maybe they mean some dumb thing, but that's what they should mean. Europeans traditionally thought ethnically. It's about what language you speak. And that language you speak is connected to a plot of land and to like an ancestral culture, right? Like, and that's not ancient, right? That's not how Europeans thought in like 1200, right? But it's how Europeans thought in the age of nationalism made Europeans ethnocentric. It made them think ethnically. And so it's like, we are the Germans, the people of Germany who have these who have these ethnic characteristics, right? We work hard and we blah, blah, blah. And so that's the sort of way that Europeans tend to think. So when you get people from Syria and Egypt and Algeria and, Afghanistan, Pakistan, whatnot, coming into Europe, like those defense mechanisms activate just as much as they would if like, Romanians go into Hungary and the Hungarians get mad. Like these are countries with strong histories of ethnic cleansing and, extreme local language-based nationalism. So Americans tend to think in terms of racial stuff, right? We tend to think, oh, you're white, you're black, you're, I'm not sure what to call this race from the Middle East, but you're sort of not white. But like Europeans, obviously appearance matters, but language matters a lot to them. And it's just basically any like outsiders were not part of your nation. And of course, European countries have evolved a lot since that era of nationalism. They've become a lot more liberal. They've become a lot more cosmopolitan. So, but people who go to Europe still say, wow, this is more racist than America. Because at the grassroots level, at the level of the attitudes and bigotry and just like, who gets a job and who gets a loan and who wants to live next to who and all those standard things, like Europe is still most of the places in Europe are still more racist. Maybe not Netherlands, or maybe not. Like most of the places in Europe are feel more racist at the grassroots level than America does, because America's used to diversity and Europe's not. So it had to get used to this diversity, and so it's not good at assimilation, right? In America, it's like you have a house, you have a lawn, you own a gas station, Quickie Mart. Like, you have an American flag and you say this Pledge of Allegiance and blah, blah. Congratulations, you're an American. Join the football team. And that's our, obviously not everyone in America thinks like that. You have your frog trolls on Twitter who are like, defend the white race. Like, we've always hated those people. Mainstream American society's always hated those people. You read World War II memoirs of like Marines from World War II, and they're making fun of those guys in the 1940s. Right? They're like making fun of like, there was this guy, there's this book, Helmet for My Pillow, that you should read about World War II. That's actually not the Marines. That one's the Army. But there's this dude, he's narrating, and there's this guy in their unit, and everyone has a nickname. It's in the Army, right? Everyone has a nickname, and one of the guys is nicknamed White Man, which is funny because it's a segregated unit where everyone has to be white. Except Chinese people. They could have Chinese people, but they didn't. But anyway, it's a segregated unit. They name one guy White Man. Why do they name one guy White Man in an all-white unit? Because he's always talking about the white race and how important it is. Wow. And so we've always hated the frog trolls in America. Like, and this guy narrating this stuff, he's not like, he's not a liberal. He's actually kind of a conservative guy, but he thinks like the equivalent of the Groypers of the, alt-right dipshits. He's making fun of them in the 1940s. And so America, so Europe has this much more deep level of sort of like exclusion, and it's really ethnic, not even racial. It used to be religious, like there used to be a Christian, non-Christian thing. It's not that anymore. But that sort of bled into a lot of these attitudes, and it's very localistic. It's like you know how, like, I don't know, going in America, when I go from more cosmopolitan places like Texas, honestly, to less cosmopolitan places like Michigan, I sort of feel more of a localism. People feel more tied to their small towns. Like, there's people who are tied to small towns in Texas, but a lot of people, people drive all over the place and they'll go to Dallas and they'll go to Houston. In Michigan, you meet people from small towns who like never go to Detroit or Chicago or even Grand Rapids, right? They just hang out in a small town for the whole life, and that's where they live. It's a bit provincial. Europe is like more provincial than Michigan. And so you get these very provincial attitudes. And so it's hard to assimilate people. It's hard to assimilate immigrants. You can't just copy America's policies at a high level and expect everything to work the same at the grassroots level, at the ground level. And so they, and the third thing is that Europe has this social protections, which involve protections, restrictions on firing anybody. And also restriction, so that means that companies are very, very careful about who they hire because they know they'll never be able to fire them. Well, guess what? Some immigrant guy comes from like Algeria, comes walking up and he's like, "Hey, I want a job." They're like, "Well," and so I couldn't fire this guy if I had to. And I don't know about him. He's weird. He doesn't I can't use the typical social cues of how people dress and act and talk to determine if this guy will be a guy that I'll need to fire later. America's like, okay, I'll hire you. I'll fire you next week if I need to. Of course, DEI stuff might be now preventing that, which could be a problem. But in America, people were easily hired and easily fired. In Europe, they were not easily fired, so they weren't easily hired either. So that really excluded a lot of people from labor market opportunities. So the rigidity of the labor system combined with ethnocentrism, and this sort of like chauvinism of this extremely safe place, to just produce difficulty in assimilating immigrants in Europe. And so they're having a harder time. And the same thing is going to happen to Japan with Japan's immigration boom, which is now happening. It will experience the same problems as Europe eventually. It will solve them in a slightly nicer way because it's Japan, but it will experience many of the same problems.
Yeah. And where are those immigrants coming from?
In Japan, they're mostly coming from China and the Philippines. But there's a few immigrants from Turkey, a couple other Turkey to Japan. But like America, actually, like Americans are moving to Japan because it's better to live here. Even if you live in a smaller house, it's like a nicer place, and you get to be a weeb and you get to live your little anime dream. And I like all the guys. Did you ever meet the Japan Club back at UMich?
No, I never did.
I briefly tried to join to keep up my Japanese skills and blah blah because there are a bunch of Japanese guys in there, and I quickly realized that the club was made up almost entirely of Japanese business bros who came to study in America, and then white Midwestern girls who wanted to date the Japanese business bros, and eventually all moved to Japan. And so to live the anime dream,
that's funny
of dating anime boys, and they did, and then now they all live here. And anyway, so Americans, moved to Japan as well. But so anyway, Japan's going to have some of those same problems with immigration. But first, Japan's going to have problems with tourism. So we didn't talk about this a lot before, but Japan has this big tourism boom. They've already banned tourists from the central district from Gion, the old geisha district, in Kyoto because of rowdy tourists. But not just rowdy, but just too many, honestly. And there's going to be, increasing restrictions on tourists in Japan because they have, and Venice is doing the same thing. Like European cities have had to do the same thing.
Yeah, makes sense. What about the EU? Talk about kind of the state of the EU and what you predict for the future of the EU.
EU is interesting. So the Euro crisis really showed the worst of the EU. The Euro crisis showed that when you have a bunch of countries that manage their own fiscal policy independently, but have all the same currency, you're in trouble. Because one of the basic lessons of macroeconomics, actually Econ 102 here, is that fiscal policy and monetary policy in some sense are substitutes. So if you have low interest rates and deficits, those do kind of similar things. And if you have high interest rates and austerity, those do similar things, right? Roughly, they reduce demand. High austerity and then high interest rates will both reduce demand. They will put a brake on your economy. They will lower inflation, et cetera, et cetera. So fiscal policy and monetary policy sort of can cancel each other out or work together. Now, here's the thing. When you have a whole bunch of when everybody does their own fiscal policy, but your monetary policy is set by one central bank, a European central bank, because of these countries in the Eurozone, well, you have a problem, right? Because, you have Germany trying to do austerity, and that's determining a lot of, then the European Central Bank has to lower interest rates even more to cancel that out in a recession. That's a problem. And you have also the unified currency also disallows devaluation by export. So like when Greece was having trouble, you couldn't have Greece just like devalue the currency because their currency was the euro. So they couldn't just export their way out of the crisis because the crisis was, they're in the Eurozone, right? Because they didn't have a currency to depreciate. So those two problems were big economic problems with having this block, right? And America solves this because, number one, America, the United States has a single fiscal policy at the central government level, right? Our states don't even really get to do fiscal policy because they all have balanced budget amendments. So our states don't really do fiscal policy. All our fiscal policy, all our Keynesian whatever, is done at the level of the federal government with stimulus bills like Obama's stimulus, right? We don't have states running their own fiscal policies. And because of that, we don't get that lack of coordination. Also, we don't have state-specific recessions typically. And one reason is because we don't have states default on, like Greece. States can't act like Greece because they have those balanced budget amendments. So America has a fiscal union and a single currency. So we actually do really well here. Whereas, ironically, China is like doing a little worse because too much of China's fiscal policies run through its local governments, and unlike America. And so these local governments have borrowed tons of money, and now they're in massive amounts of debt, and it's holding back their economy, and it's going to screw them over going forward. They don't even have property taxes. So actually, China is too much like a little bit too much like Europe in this regard. But Europe is much worse in this regard. So that's the problem with the EU. And that's one problem. The other problem is that the bureaucrats who run the EU have a bad cultural habit of just dishing out a whole bunch of really dumb regulations. Like they don't have to be that way. Like Europe could choose to not do that. But they do. They choose to do that. And so it's very difficult to have one country in Europe that decides, well, we're just going to deregulate and be the champion of AI or, champion of IT industry. So Europe should be a software cluster because everyone in East Europe and Ireland can program computers, and they're really good. There's, arguably more talent than us in terms of software, but they can't do anything with it because the European regulations on the internet industries and now AI are really just stopping them from having the kind of dynamic tech companies like OpenAI, or, I would 10 years ago I would have said Google, but now I can't because Google's kind of, degenerating. But Google was really good in its heyday, right? Microsoft was great in its heyday and is now great again. And Google may be great again someday. They probably need a new CEO. I don't know. Sorry if you're listening to this and you like that. So then, or Amazon, or they have trouble with this stuff because of regulation. And so they can't leverage all this talent that they have in software.
Yeah.
And so there's a problem with Europe, but it's entirely a problem of their own making. They could just wake up tomorrow and choose not to do any of that. But they have some cultural issues.
So do you think the EU will exist as we understand it for the foreseeable future? It's like a stable...
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know. I will say that Ukraine and the threat from Russia is a massive shot in the arm for the EU. Because now there's a unifying purpose for the EU instead of just grow, right? Instead of just economic growth or whatever, there's this purpose that everyone in Europe can agree on, which is resist the empire. The evil empire's next door. They're conquering Ukraine, but then they're going to come for the Baltics, which are in the EU, and they're going to come for Poland, which is in the EU. They're coming for them. And that means that Europe is going to have to defend itself. Obviously, the EU isn't a military organization. NATO is the military arm of the EU, really, and America's in it. But to the degree that America steps back from NATO because of Trump, the Trumpists in Congress who are blocking Ukraine aid, and Trump who constantly wants to withdraw from NATO, but even if those people are defeated, even if the Trumpists are defeated in America, America will still have to step back from Europe for the simple reason that all the real action is in Asia. Like, that's the much more powerful threat, and it's much more economically important to us. And America is going, even with no Trump, even if the Trump has vanished tomorrow, America is still going to step back from Europe. And that leaves, who does that leave in charge of Europe? Well, Britain withdrew, and Britain is still in NATO, so it's still allied with Europe, but it's not Europe. Germany is just messing around and still like trying to prove to themselves they're not Nazis. It leaves France. France is in charge of Europe now. There are times when that line would have struck a chord of fear into the hearts of many. But now, yeah, so Macron is really stepping up, and that's good. It's good. He's taking on France's old traditional role as the arbiter of Europe, right? And so that's what's going to happen. So European unity against Putin and the new Russian Empire. Am I okay calling it the new Russian Empire? Does that sound too cheesy, or what do you think?
No, you can call it that.
All right, new Russian Empire. Europe is going to have to unite against that, and that's a big shot in the arm for the EU in terms of like pro-growth economic policies, especially pro-energy economic policies. So we'll see if they can get their butts in gear there.
Maybe segueing a bit to the Middle East, but we'll leave some for next episode too. Turkey. So
Turkey had really, really bad macroeconomic policy for a while. So let's step back. Turkey has been developing really well. They had a manufacturing export industry that's really, pretty good. They're not as export intensive as like Poland, but they export a lot of stuff. They got some FDI to make, cars for Germany and stuff like that. And Turkey has a lot of domestic manufacturing, Bayraktar, the drone people. Well, they got nationalized, and so they might not be as good going forward. But Turkey is actually pretty good at manufacturing. And one thing about Turkey is they have connections to Europe and they have connections to the Middle East. They're fulfilling this classic role as this bridge between Europe and the Middle East. So Europeans will invest in them and buy their stuff, and then Turkey will make stuff, but they'll also sell stuff to the Middle East. So Turkey will sell stuff to Dubai. Turkey will sell stuff to Qatar. Turkey will sell stuff to anybody there, Saudis. And so so Turkey's in this really good position there to be able to export to a lot of markets. And Turkey, they're actually pretty good at manufacturing. They're also nationalistic in their promotion of manufacturing. So Turkey just implemented really harsh non-tariff barriers to essentially block Chinese car imports. And they're like, no, we're going to make the cars, not you. And so like Turkey, has no problem doing this. Turkey has reached about the same per capita GDP as Poland. I think they're a little bit behind, but it's pretty close. And so Turkey is on the cusp of being a developed country. You go to Turkey, it feels like, I'm not old enough to really remember what America in the 80s felt like as a little kid, but then it feels like 80s America. It feels about that rich, and on paper it's that rich. And so Turkey is what we would have called a developed country 35 years ago. Okay, and it's up to that. So it's pretty developed. And it's got a lot of high tech stuff, and it's actually doing all right. Turkey has this leader, Erdogan, who's kind of one of these like sort of quasi autocratic leaders who, gets in power on a populist wave and degrades the democratic process and feuds with the existing institutions. He's what Trump would like to be. If Trump comes back, he's going to be like Erdogan. There was like an abortive pseudo coup attempt against him. There were these massive protests against him that failed to dislodge him. And he did some dumb economic stuff. But yet he retains the majority support, I suppose, of the Turkish people. And although it's pretty divided, right? It's close to 50-50, but he still has the edge. And so Erdogan is what Trump would love to be, and what Trump will become somewhat like if he gets reelected this year. And so Erdogan made a big mistake, which was he got this idea that low interest rates will lower inflation. Now, Econ 102 will tell us that lower interest rates are inflationary. That will raise inflation. In fact, we kept monetary policy very easy, interest rates very low in COVID and right after COVID, and then we had this burst of inflation. Then we raised interest rates, the inflation went away. That's how stuff's supposed to work. Turkey got Turkey, Erdogan got the idea that he could make water flow uphill. The things worked exactly the opposite. There was opposite day in terms of how interest rates affect the economy. That caused a big currency crash in Turkey and was causing really rampant inflation. Then they got a new central bank head who sort of reversed it, raised interest rates, blah, blah. They're going back to the orthodox policy, and now they're doing well. Like Turkey's actually doing, economically well. They're macroeconomically, they're recovering from like high inflation, and it didn't quite get to hyperinflation. That's good because the Turkish economy could have collapsed. Currency, lowering the currency is fine because that pumps up exports. So they've been doing well there. There's a deep reason why Erdogan made this mistake, which is there was so much external real estate investment into Turkey that when you raised interest rates, that would draw a lot of real estate investment, and that would draw a lot of so when you raised interest rates, it would it would draw in a lot of investment into like Turkish bonds. And that would get invested into real estate. But that overwhelmed the typical demand effect, this foreign real estate investment and bond investment effect. And that would create a bunch of demand, and that demand would juice the economy, which would juice inflation. So it looked like raising interest rates would raise inflation, but it was only a temporary small effect. And so that sort of tricked Erdogan into thinking this idea. There actually are some academic theories that say that raising interest rates over the long term will raise inflation, but they're kind of kooky theories, honestly. And so I think Erdogan has seen the error of his ways, and I think Turkey's doing pretty well now. And so I'm pretty bullish on Turkey for the long term. Although there's the question of like who leads after Erdogan.
Right. I want to be mindful of time here. We're at the hour. We got through a bunch of Europe today, and we still have the rest of for the next episode, the rest of the Middle East, Africa, South America.
It's becoming a long running series. All right, let's do the third part of the trilogy. Will be next time.
Perfect. Okay, Noah, enjoy the rest of Japan, and until next time. Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and eriktorenberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.